Rivian R2 is finally here and it is impressive. I got to take it for a demo drive, and as I do, I got deep into the tech features, so let's talk about those first impressions. If you're new here, welcome. I'm Mike, you're watching Thunderbolt Auto, and in this one, we're going over my first impressions demo driving the R2. I focused mostly on the tech and autonomy because that's kind of my jam, and if that's your jam too, hit subscribe so you don't miss when I talk about more R2 stuff coming in the future, because I'm going to be covering a lot of it. Before we get into the cool tech stuff that I found about the R2, just wanted to give a quick shout out to the merch drop that just happened. You can find t-shirts and stickers at shop.tvoltauto.com or linked down below. I got a chance to test drive the R2 earlier today, and I already felt like it was an impressive vehicle, but man, it really is an impressive vehicle. The feature set that it has and how premium it feels is just incredible for the price point. I think people are really going to love it. I didn't get a whole lot of time with the vehicle, so these are just my very quick first impressions, but the first impressions were really good. It has some really good tech, and I kind of dived into some of that. So let's actually get into my demo drive experience. I'll show a quick walk around to the vehicle and go on a quick test drive, and then we'll come back here in between and I'll interject some extra thoughts along the way. So let's go. Also, I want to give a huge thanks to the folks at the Rivian Service Center in Salt Lake City. They're always so great to work with, and I want to thank them for helping me get this video done. What is up? Behind me, I have the brand new R2, and we're going for a test drive. I'm going to give you all the quick impressions that I can. Let's go. It's clean, it's beautiful. This is the Catalina Cove on the 21-inch liquid tungsten wheels. This is the spec that everyone has been talking about. There we go. Just hit unlock on the Launch Edition key fob. This Launch Edition has the special launch green on the outside, which is super cool. Door handles at the block party, they felt very smooth. Oh, buttery. That is so much better than the R1 door handles. They solved the squeak on that one. Okay, so here's the front fascia. We've got the radar that sits right here. We've got the front camera. This is positioned a little bit differently than on the R1. On the R1, it's sort of like tilted down and a little bit below protective. This is just kind of out in the open, so we'll see how it does with rock chips. If you're in a state that requires a front plate, I'm sorry. This is how it mounts up. It basically just kind of like sits in this groove right here and drills right into the bumper. It's horrible, it's ugly, so I am so sorry if you're in a state that requires front plates. They should be outlawed. But one thing to note with this as well is this is not a powered frunk, but you don't have to slam it either. You can just sort of get it down into the latch, and then it soft closes and pulls itself in. There's a little button here. This is not a capacitive touch button, so just a touch doesn't do it. It's actually a force button, so if you push down on it, then it pops open, and it does pop open by itself, and that alone, I think, increases usability quite a bit. One of the big things that I wanted to see on my demo drive experience was the UI sounds that the vehicle makes. And this isn't something that I necessarily have a lot of experience in, but I do appreciate good sound design when it comes to the feedback that a system gives you, the beeps and the bloops and so on and so forth. And I actually had a chance to talk specifically about the UI sound design with Eric Glaser, the head of Rivian's UX team, back when I was at the R2 launch, or the R2 block party in Denver. And one of the ones that he mentioned specifically that they were changing was the closure sound when you try to lock the vehicle, but not all of the doors are closed. On the R1, it sounds like this. And he calls it the clown horn, which is kind of funny, but that's a pretty good description for what it is. He's not particularly fond of that sound. And he mentioned that they were updating it to sound more modern with the R2, and this is what it sounds like. Additionally, he mentioned that they were changing the sounds of the turn signals so they could be more audible at freeway speeds. So it's a similar sort of sound to what you have in the R1, but it has a higher pitch to it, so it can stand out from the din of highway traffic a little bit better, and it is indeed more audible. Undecided if I like it better or not, because I'm very fond of the deep thunk that's in the R1 turn signal. When I spoke with Eric about this at the R2 block party, he did say that it's quite possible that these sound changes will get backported to the R1 when Rivian OS 2, the operating system that runs on R2, when that operating system gets ported back to the R1 vehicles, it's quite possible that these sounds will also be part of that process. So only time will tell on that one. One set of sounds that I was not expecting to hear that they added was a subtle little sound to indicate when you're in drive or reverse. And the sounds sound like this for drive and this for reverse. And this is something that's new to Rivian. It's been in Teslas for a long time, the little sound to confirm that you're in gear. And I suspect that Rivian is adding it here for new EV drivers because a lot of people might be used to sort of a physical sensation when you put it into reverse or drive. And so in an EV where you don't really have a transmission that you're going to feel that shift, that's just an extra little confirmation. I suspect that's why they did it anyway. One other thing I wanted to talk about before we get into the actual driving segment was the Haptic Halo wheels on the steering wheel. There's been a lot of talk about it, but they're very cool. A lot of people are describing them in a way that makes them feel like very heavy pieces of metal, and they just don't feel that way. They are made out of plastic, and they do feel like plastic. That's not to say that they feel cheap, because they do feel premium. It is a premium touch point. And the haptic feedback when you scroll is actually really nice feeling, but they don't feel like a heavy piece of metal. I would describe it more as like a fine jewelry type of feel rather than a heavy lock kind of a feel, if that sort of makes sense. It's really cool how these things work. I actually learned about this again from Eric at the R2 block party. The way that they handle this is they have a motor that's attached to these scroll wheels that can both tell how far you're turning it as well as provide resistance. In fact, the motors are technically capable of just spinning the wheels all by themselves so they can just free spin. They aren't doing that. They don't have them set up to do that, but technically they could. They also have a sensor at the back left corner and the bottom right corner. And this sensor is able to tell when you push on the wheel, pull on the wheel, or tilt it from side to side. And because of the opposed direction of these two sensors, it can tell exactly which gesture you're making. And then the motor that's inside of that wheel can provide different notches of resistance. The result of this is it changes where the detents are and how far apart they're spaced depending on what menu you're in. So if you're adjusting temperature, for example, they're very small, fine detents. If you're adjusting fan speed, they're larger chunks or bigger spaces between the detents. And when you get to the end of the list, it kind of hits some resistance. And that's actually a really nice way to communicate with the driver without requiring them to take their eyes off of the road. I actually experienced a very good use case for this while I was on my demo drive. I was trying to turn the volume all the way down, and at the time I had the turn signal turned on, and so it was showing the blind spot camera on the driver's display. However, the blind spot camera shows right on top of where the volume control normally shows. And so ordinarily I wouldn't be able to know when I've reached the bottom of the volume when I've hit 0. But even though I couldn't see it, I could tell that I had reached 0 because when I hit the bottom of the volume slider, the wheel quit scrolling. It sort of pushed back against my finger. So I could very easily and quickly tell exactly what was happening. And the sort of communication that happens with the driver without any need for visuals or sounds is absolutely incredible. And I think we'll see a lot of cool use cases for this in the future. But those are my thoughts on the haptic scroll wheel. Without further ado, let's get into the actual driving portion of the demo. One of the really nice things about the R2 is their new HVAC system. The new heat pump is absolutely fantastic. It is so much quieter than the Gen 2 R1. I really like it. By the way, this camera clarity is absolutely incredible. Same camera system that's on the R1. The difference being this mirror camera right here, the driver monitoring camera. That one is a little bit different in that it's a full color RGB camera. Before, on the R1, it was an infrared camera And so it could see through sunglasses because it's an infrared camera and it could see what you're looking at through the sunglasses. This is an RGB camera, and I'm assuming it probably can't see through your glasses the same way. So I will be doing a sunglasses test. Quick note, by the way, on that turn signal sound that you just heard there. That is slightly different from the R1, and that's actually something that Eric was saying was different, because the deep thud of the R1 is a very pleasing sound. It's a very premium sound, but it's a little hard to hear at freeway speed. This one definitely seems like it'd be easier. What's interesting about it is it's still a single click. Where most automakers, you have sort of a tick-tock sound as the light turns on and off. This one is still just a single click for each blink, but the sounds are different. It's still sort of a tick-tock sound, but at half the speed of a normal car. I don't know. The sound is interesting. We'll come back to that in a second, but I'm just going to kick on UHF, Universal Hands-Free. And it just kicked right on there. The visualization looks largely the same as it does in the R1. It does feel like it's running at a slightly lower resolution, though. The graphics on it look a little bit blurry compared to the R1, which is kind of interesting. And it looks like the factory screen protector has been taken off at this point, so I don't know if it's a screen protector. I don't know. That's interesting, because the actual screen itself, even though it's smaller than the screen in the R1, it is higher resolution, and this one as well. And that's interesting to me, and maybe it's just me, but it feels like those 3D graphics are just a bit on the fuzzy side, which is so interesting to me. Because this screen, running off of the same infotainment computer, it's the same computer that runs both, by the way, this feels extremely snappy, way, way, way faster than the R1 screen. Like, it's still running a Qualcomm processor, just like the R1, but it's definitely a lot more powerful. All right, so I'm gonna jump on the highway here. We're gonna go into sport mode and see how it feels on the on-ramp here. Oh, wow. Okay, this is a rocket ship. Okay, so interesting note here. By the way, while we're talking, I'm going to be doing some autonomy testing here. Okay, so that acceleration just felt wild compared to the R1. I have a dual performance R1, and that technically has a faster 0 to 60 than this has. However, the acceleration drops off when you're at highway speed on the R1. This does not drop off at highway speed. Like, that is a lot of pep. So even though technically it's got a slower 0 to 60, only slightly, but a slightly slower 0 to 60 than the R1 performance, this easily outperforms at highway speed. So that's fantastic. Okay, so let's talk about autonomy real quick. Granted, I'm not spending a ton of time with it here. This is just a quick first drive impression, but based on the first impression, it feels very much like the same autonomy system as R1. One difference is the stock here. You still pull it towards you to engage, but it has actually the controls for universal hands-free right here on the stock. There's two dials on it. The one that's closer to the end of the stock is the speed, and then you have your drive style, mild, medium, and spicy, on the inner of the wheels. You still have lane change on demand, just like you do with the R1. And you can also, with the Haptic Halo here, you can use this to set speed as well. One interesting thing with the set speed, though, is on the R1 and on this knob right here, you can sort of flick it up or down, and that'll do 5-mile-an-hour increments. If you do it on this, if you flick it up or down, it just flicks however many notches you happen to have flicked it. And so it gets, you can do 10 miles an hour or more in one shot. I'm assuming there's probably going to be a software update to change this in the future, because that seems a little bit hard. Once my hand's on the wheel for this curve, this is the same universal hands-free that we know. And just like anytime I've done the mountain loop test on my vehicle, it feels plenty capable. When I'm putting my hands on the steering wheel, it doesn't feel like it's lacking in confidence at all. It's just asking for it for reasons unbeknownst to me. So it clearly has the same universal hands-free that we've experienced on the R1. It is running the same model that it's running on the R1, but with some slight tuning adjustments for the R2, because it's physically smaller and the camera placement's going to be a little bit different because of that. But it feels very much like the same system. The lane change on demand works extremely well, and it asks for hands on the wheel in more situations than I would hope for. Just like I said many times on my mountain loop autonomy test, it feels like every time it asks for hands on the wheel, it's kind of unnecessary. It feels like it's perfectly capable, doesn't feel lacking in confidence. Just out of an abundance of caution, I think it's doing it. And I suspect that we'll see that get very relaxed with some of the updates that are coming for universal hands-free. One of the other interesting changes for the R2 is the driver monitoring camera. In R1, it has an infrared camera in the mirror, and it looks like this. And it basically has the idea to see through sunglasses and actually look at where you're looking and make sure that you're watching the road. The R2 has a full color RGB camera, and it looks like this. And the reason they changed to just like a normal full color camera is so they can enable other features. Like, for example, on pet mode, they plan to add the ability to look at a live feed of your pet while you're in the store and make sure that everything's okay. But the thing about RGB cameras is it's quite likely that it actually can't necessarily see through sunglasses. And this is the same kind of camera that Tesla uses for their cabin cameras, just a full color RGB. And I was curious, if I put on sunglasses, if the system would have any trouble with that. And in my very brief time with the vehicle, again, I need to have more time to do a full deep dive on it, but in my brief time with the vehicle, it had no trouble at all with the sunglasses. In fact, it didn't nag me for watching the road even once. So it seems to handle that very well. One other thing that I was looking pretty closely at on my drive was the autonomy view on the driver's screen. I wasn't sure if it was going to have a more cropped field of view, because the screen is physically narrower than what we have on the R1 already. And so I wasn't sure if they were going to, crop off the top and the bottom of the view, but it seems what they did instead was just shrink the autonomy view down. And it felt to me like I could see just as far as I'm used to seeing on the R1 and just as much detail. Everything was smooth. One interesting thing to note about that is the frame rate for this 3D visualization has been kind of a long-standing issue for the R1. In many software versions, it's kind of glitchy, it's kind of laggy, it drops frames. It's a lot better in the most recent update that we got in May, but on the R2, I didn't notice any frame drops at all. It seemed perfectly smooth the whole time, buttery. What I did have a little bit of concern with was the resolution of this rendering. I couldn't quite put my finger on why with the brief time that I had, but it felt like that 3D visualization was just a little bit fuzzy. And I'm not sure if it's because it was just so shrunken down on that screen, there just aren't as many pixels to work with. Maybe it's just set to a lower render resolution on Unreal Engine. Not entirely sure why it felt that way. I'll want to dive into that a little bit more when I get more time with the R2. But along with that buttery smooth frame rate that I was noticing on the visualization, it is worth noting that the infotainment system as a whole on the R2 has a more powerful chip than the R1, and it's quite noticeable. It still is a Qualcomm powered system, but it is snappy. Both screens are higher resolution than the ones we find in the R1, and everything was loading instantly. It was smooth. It did not have any lag at any point in time. So I think Rivian did a great job with that. Another interesting thing worth calling out with the infotainment system and Rivian OS 2, which, by the way, OS 2 is fantastic. The design language is beautiful. The animations are gorgeous. I love OS 2 and I cannot wait for it to come on the R1. One of the big talking points for OS 2 is this integration with iHeartRadio. What I didn't realize though is it seems as if the iHeartRadio integration is actually replacing a physical radio tuner in the R2. It seems like it doesn't actually have an FM tuner. Instead, you just use internet radio, and they have the UI set up to look like it's a physical tuner, but you can't just tune the radio to whatever you want. You have to choose one of the specific iHeartRadio curated stations. I could be wrong about this. It might just be early software, but that's what it looks like. And to be fair, most people won't care about this. Most people, myself included, just stream their music. But for the small group of people that does listen to the radio, this may be kind of a blow. So I'm a little bit curious how these drive modes function. So in our on-road, we have all-purpose, sport, conserve, and snow. They've changed a little bit how the efficiency is handled on these vehicles. On the R1, it has a disconnect on the rear axle. So when you don't need the extra power, it's front wheel drive only. They've switched that for this vehicle, so it's a rear wheel drive only in most scenarios. And so you just saw there, we're an all purpose, and it does appear to be driving only on the rear axle. As we went around the corner, it had power going to all four wheels. And then it appears that just like the R1, it drops off that front axle this time for more efficiency. Also, nice little note, I don't have the navigation showing on here, but I do have directions, just tiny little here at the bottom, but very clear. I'm going to be turning left in 1.7 miles to get back to the Rivian Service Center. I'm actually going to change this to be my map view, although it will not let me do that while we're in universal hands-free. So I'm going to go ahead and make that change now, down to this. Okay, perfect. Now I have my map view in there. It is somewhat of a shame that they won't let you see the map view while you're in autonomy, but it makes sense because, you know, they want you to see what the autonomy system is doing and all the vehicles it sees around. But it looks like we are just almost exclusively rear-wheel drive. It seems to be pretty aggressive here about staying on the rear axle only. We're still not blending in that front axle for braking, which is actually kind of surprising to me because the front axle is typically where you want to have more of the braking power. Same principle as like, on a bicycle, the front brakes are always a little bit more powerful than the rear brakes, because that's where the weight of the vehicle naturally is, and so that's where more of the stopping power is. But in normal braking scenarios, it seems to be rear-wheel drive only. Okay, we've got all four wheels for takeoff here, and then as soon as we get over 20, yep, that front axle drops off. Okay, so I'm going to move over to conserve. And I instantly feel that the throttle pedal is a little bit less responsive. It feels a little bit squishier, which makes sense. From my understanding, conserve mode also limits HVAC performance and just, kind of tones things down in general just for better efficiency. But same behavior with the disconnect there. I'm guessing that here we're going to have, oh, nope, it's rear only. Wow, it is very aggressive about being in rear wheel drive only. If we pop over to sport, that should lock us in all wheel drive all the time. And yep, we're seeing that going over 20. Yep, we're all wheel drive all the time there. And then snow mode, of course, is going to be all wheel drive all the time because that gives you ultimate control in slippery conditions. So honestly, I'm pretty pleased with how they have that set up. One thing I'm curious about with regard to the drive mode is if it automatically resets. One thing that has been sort of a plague for R1 owners is on the dual motor system, it resets to all-purpose mode every time. The EPA limit is after it's been parked for 4 hours. And so after being parked for 4 hours, it resets to all purpose every time, just because that's how the EPA rating was set. When they went through the EPA cycle, Rivian had it in that mode, and so it has to return to that mode. The tri and quad motor vehicles were not set up that way for the EPA testing, and so they actually are just fine staying in the mode that you parked them in. Given that both all-purpose and conserve use the same philosophy for connecting and disconnecting that front axle, I'm wondering if this will stay in the drive mode that you leave it, like you would hope. So to be seen on that one. Heat pump, by the way, just so much quieter. It's interesting because playing around with the ventilated seats, actually, the ventilated seats are quite strong. It almost feels to me like it's got an AC duct in it, like it's not just blowing air, like it's actually blowing air-conditioned air. It is the strongest ventilated seat I have ever felt. So we're just about to get back to the service center here. And I want to play around with the ride feel a little bit. This ride feel, I presume, is enabled by the semi-active suspension on this performance trim specifically. The R2 doesn't have like the crazy fancy air suspension that the R1 has, but on the performance trim, it does have some valves in the dampers that can adjust how firm the ride is. So I'll play around with that a little bit. But honestly, this is a great impression for the first drive. You know, it obviously has fewer features than the R1, but it does not feel less premium. But yeah, as I was saying, there's more to come with universal hands-free. UHF Phase 2 is coming out Q3 of this year, and what Phase 2 is going to include is lane change, automatic lane change on the freeway. You get lane change on command when you're just on any surface street. It'll stop at stoplights and stop signs. So it's got a fair number of extra features that people have been waiting for. And it's not available yet on R1 or R2. But I'm excited to see how that is. But for now, the autonomy system in R2 feels just like it does in R1, and which makes sense. It's the same model, just with a couple of tuning tweaks, because the R2 is a smaller vehicle. The cameras are in slightly different places, but it's the same model that's running on the R1, and you can feel it, which is not a bad thing because it is like a very solid model. One interesting thing is that the R2 does not ship with Rivian Assistant, and a couple of the extra like camp modes and things like that. And that's just because there's some vehicle specific tuning that needs to be done with that. For example, Rivian Assistant needs to know that this vehicle doesn't have a power closing frunk. It doesn't have power charge ports, or power charge port door, I should say. So there's a couple of things that unfortunately are coming within the first update or two after launch that R1 already has. So even though there is some software work to be done, fantastic first impression. So anyway, thanks for going on the first drive with me. I cannot wait to get this on the mountain loop. Stay tuned because we'll be making that happen. So there you go. There's my initial impressions of R2 Tech doing the demo drive. As soon as I can, I'm going to get my hands on one so that we can do a deep dive on more of the tech and do the mountain loop test. Because even though it felt very similar to the R1, I want to see if it actually performs exactly the same way in the mountain loop test. So we'll be doing all of that testing as soon as I can. Hit subscribe so you don't miss that.
Has been some speculation on this little bit right here. It's stylistically sort of designed to look like the R1 light segments, but it does not have RGB in there. It's just more of a stylistic thing. Right below the V on R1S.
I am obsessed